To be honest, I'm not really that much into anime, despite what, like, 2 videos will entail. Well, at least not nowadays. Back in elementary to middle school, I really thought anime was great. But even now, I still think that even if I got tired of the genre, I still like quite a few anime. I like Dragon Ball, One Piece, Hunter x Hunter, Full Metal Alchemist, Evangelion, Bleach, etc. However, there is one anime that stuck up to me just as much as the rest, and that anime was Naruto. Originally written and drawn by Masashi Kishimoto in 1999, ending the main story of Naruto in 2014, Naruto is probably one of the most influential shonen manga and anime of all time. Even when it was waning in popularity and quality, people still mentioned it, referenced it, or just simply followed it. I feel like part of the reason that Naruto took off like it did was because of its world and characters. Parts of the world were really well explained, the way jutsus and abilities worked made sense, until it didn't, but that's a discussion for another time. The characters were charismatic and unique, and their powers were so cool, especially with those jutsu hand signs. Naturally, as with any franchise where the character has popular moves that mainly exist to push the action forward, there literally has to be a video game for it. There have been plenty of Naruto games within the past 2 decades already, but there's one specific game series that stuck out to many people, and that series was Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm. The first Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm is looked upon pretty nostalgically and fondly by people born in the late 90s and early to mid 2000s. Many people my age say that this was their childhood game series even. So with that said, does this game or the series age well at all, or is it just vision through rose-tinted glasses clouding our objectivity? Well, I guess that's what we're gonna find out today when we talk about the first game in the series, simply titled Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm. Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm, the successor to Naruto Ultimate Ninja, was a fighting game released in 2008, developed by CyberConnect 2 and published by Bandai Namco. I could be wrong, but I have a theory that this series served to introduce a new audience to Naruto games after Naruto Ultimate Ninja was 5 mainline games in at this point. It would make sense that people grew tired of that series and wanted something different. This was Naruto's first 3D arena fighting game as well. So in 2008, the first game in the Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm series was released, and it was received pretty well for its fun gameplay, neat visuals, and fun retelling of old stories. As you can see, at that time, the game was praised for its ideas. The game was pretty much what put Naruto on the map for video games, in the modern era at least. There were generally good ideas in this game that would definitely allow this game to appeal to newer people that wanted to play a new Naruto game, but didn't want to play a series that was already 5 games in. This made this game probably the most accessible Naruto game at the time, because they pretty much started from square one, but also took ideas from the other series. Unfortunately, the issue with this game is that it really doesn't flesh out its ideas whatsoever, and some of them are just straight up terrible. A good example of this is the hub world in the game. The hub world is something that seems fun to roam around in if you watch, say, a YouTube video or something, but I swear playing it is kinda miserable. The camera is the thing that destroyed the experience for me. The camera doesn't have a mind of its own, thank god, but it's too close to you, and it's so awkward to control. I know this isn't some Assassin's Creed open world game, but this camera is still hellishly terrible. The movement by itself is fine, maybe a little fun sometimes, but the camera control is so weird because of how it works. Also, the mission structure is completely confusing because this world is too hard to navigate sometimes, in spite of it being smaller than an actual open world game. But what about the actual campaign? Well, there really isn't much of one. You just do these smaller missions and complete them, and unlock more missions. This can include a series of minigames and a fight, or it can just be a straight up fight by itself, or maybe even a series of fights. There isn't really a straightforward campaign in this game, and this all plays into the issue I have with the mission structure. Also, there's click-through dialogue, get me out of this fucking nightmare. First off, these minigames are actually terrible. The scripted ones where you're going in one direction are janky and rigid to control. The tree running minigame and the one where you have to catch Akamaru are weirdly unruly to control. They are pretty much just auto runners, but it reminds me of Sonic of the Secret Rings for some reason. Also, I hate the ones where you're in the open world. In those minigames, the camera becomes wildly dumb, especially in that Konohamaru hide-and-seek minigame. It becomes shit because it's already way too close and you can't configure the sensitivity, which makes things worse. I wouldn't complain about broken minigames if it was, say, a Yakuza minigame. But the difference is that Naruto storms are imperative. This game and Yakuza are not at all tantamount besides having mini-games as a whole. They become so annoying that I wish you could just skip these damn mini-missions. To take a quick detour, the visuals are pretty good. I really think that the original 7th gen version looked a little better with the motion blur, but some would disagree of course. I feel like the stiffer look on 8th gen consoles just didn't work for me, but at least on PC you could probably mod it in or something. However, the minigames and graphics are not the most important part of the game, obviously. The real meat and potatoes here is the combat, and I think it was kind of a misstep. This game's combat system is a great basis for the series, and I think that in a great way, well, it helped CC2 find their footing with these new series of games. However, it feels like this can be improved from here, because this probably is the most mashy of the Storm games. The combat is pretty basic. You just press circle or B to melee. The one good thing I will say is that unlike some games, the melee attacks don't have an absurd amount of range to the point where it's broken. But praising mediocrity is stupid anyways, so back to bitching I guess. My biggest issue with the combat is that the dodge is just double tapping the jump button sideways, which can be kind of imprecise sometimes. I also don't like that during the ultimate jutsu you have to button mash or circle twisting. That shit is stupid, honestly. I know that a lot of games did this to be unique, but Jesus, what the hell was with every single game around this time being overly obsessed with QTEs? Personally, I don't really mind QTEs when they're, say, in a very context-sensitive situation, but good god, they used it for the supers, which is especially stupid. Especially if the super isn't cool. I'm glad they got rid of this in later games, though. Also, there are plenty of mechanics that just aren't in future games, like wall fighting and jutsu clashing. I'm fine with the removal, as wall fighting in a lot of future anime games has just been there for the sake of superfluous spectacle. Also, the jutsu clashes get kind of ridiculous looking. I would say that clashing should be left to something like a Dragon Ball Z game, like Budokai Tenkaichi or something. Budokai Tenkaichi is clearly not at all technical, so I allow it there. Naruto Storm 1 just feels like it wants to be technical, but it also wants to give you next-gen spectacle like it's free candy. Also, the boss fights in this game are a complete snooze fest considering how outdated they feel. See, they did this thing that was really popular around this time, where they used a lot of the big guy in front of you that you couldn't directly attack cliché. They're just so boring and such a slog. I'll say the best boss was the final boss fight with Sasuke, but that's because it doesn't use brain-dead strategies like these fights with these pseudo-kaiju. I also don't really like what they did with the roster. The playable roster is fine, but the problems start where there are support-only characters. It's so annoying to see that you can't play as characters like Kakashi, but he instead does only one move if you press certain button for support. This character selection sucks. Something you may notice is that this game does not have an online mode at all. This is kinda dumb since this is 2008, when Street Fighter 4, Super Smash Bros. Brawl, and Soul Calibur 4 came out, and even they had online modes. It sucks because even though the combat system is really simplistic, it's fun enough to be somewhat decent for matchmaking, even though the balancing kinda sucks. I don't even play online modes in games at all anymore, but it would have been really cool casually at least. I guess it didn't need to have an online mode, but at least it has local multiplayer? I guess they just weren't ready for something like this yet. Storm 1 also has the Awakening, which never got expanded upon besides being power-ups. I think the thing that future games fixed were the Awakenings had exclusive ultimate attacks. These became so broken in the first game, but they're at least cool to look at, I guess. With all that being said and done, this game doesn't really have much to write home about. I think that this game has really good ideas, but it is the first game in a series to do something different. Just like Sonic Adventure or Spider-Man 2 the movie game, this game is a great foundation for the series, but the issue is that it doesn't end up as much fun or age as well, considering what came after. Not an amazing start, but at the same time, not the worst start at all. It's frustrating, somewhat broken, and really doesn't have many elements fleshed out, but it was a solid start for this series, and it had some really good ideas. Well, hopefully they can improve with the next one. Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm 1 was a pretty big success, in spite of how I may feel about it now. So with that, they had to greenlight a sequel, but this time that's based off the follow-up series, Naruto Shippuden. This was because Shippuden aired in Japan in 2007 and 2009 in America. and this game came out in 2010. The main stories that are adapted are the first 5 parts of Shippuden, namely the Kazekage rescue arc up until the Pain arc. This time they did something different with the story mode. Instead of having some brain-dead XP system from that other game, they actually have a story to complete. It's more straightforward and makes more sense, and I don't get why they didn't do this for the first game. So, is the story mode any good? Yes. First off, while they take plenty of liberties with the fights and settings, they still are pretty faithful. I'll get my issues out of the way first. The actual story retold is amazingly done, but the cutscenes, just like the last game, have click-through dialogue sequences. It just makes things more awkward, especially if you accidentally click the button to go through the whole damn thing. It honestly almost ruins some moments of emotion or excitement because I have to click a button for it to happen. The saving grace here is that the cutscene direction is so good that it's not all that bad. Also, there was an issue with the first game that I didn't mention, and that's how substitutions work. Basically, it's a combo escape button, but in this game, and the last one, you have to mash the hell out of it to get it to work. I'll also say that there are a lot of filler fights in this gameplay. It's not completely awful, but it kinda ruins the pacing. I know it was there for the sake of padding out the 8 hours-ish that it takes to complete the story, but I personally would have been fine without these fights. Just like the last game, there's an open world and it's somehow worse here. At least the last one had full control of Naruto, even if it wasn't the best. Now we have fixed camera angles and a slower pace, and there isn't even a sprinting or dynamic movement. You just hold forward and occasionally turn. At least it's more lively, but that doesn't take away from the fact that it's just boring. Problems aside, this is still a damn good game from its story mode. So let's talk about the visuals. They were very good in the last game, but here they're so much better. The set pieces are far better and have smooth animation to the point where it's better than the anime. I also like that in the Storm Trilogy / Legacy Pack, they added in the motion blur back, even though it's a bit more dialed back than the 7th gen version. Well, at least the combat is much better than the last game. The only problem is that it more directly works off of that game, but that's fine since it just needed to be fine-tuned and more polished. I don't think it's quite technical yet, but it's slowly getting there. Instead of shitty minigames where you run up trees or play hide-and-seek in dull open worlds, they actually added boss fights. This game has the best bosses in the entire Storm series, and probably anime games, period. They're a bit style over substance, but it's mixed well with a fairly good combat system. Every bit of animation is done so masterfully, and is in a lot of ways way better than the anime. I mentioned that it takes its own liberties, and these boss fights are exactly how that happens. You'll get something mildly accurate like Jiraiya vs. Pain, or Naruto vs. Pain, or even Naruto vs. Kakuzu. But then you'll get the Naruto vs. Sasuke fight during the Tenchi Bridge arc, which was never animated or drawn at all, and somehow it's still so good and fits the Shippuden story without feeling like filler. I especially like how somehow this game can replicate the emotional beats of the anime and still hit. Even the death of Jiraiya is so well done in this game, and you even have to take the sad, depressing walk that Naruto goes on after hearing about it. Usually in these anime games, you feel more encouraged to skip the cutscenes, but here it's so immersive that it feels like skipping would rob each fight of its emotional weight. I just love how it retells the story of Naruto Shippuden's first few arcs, even if it has a few rough patches here and there. And maybe even a few changes I don't really think were necessary. There's a reason I love the Naruto Storm series over something like the Dragon Ball Z games. I always felt like each DBZ saga being retold again and again in a barely different way doesn't make those games as special, which is why I like Dragon Ball FighterZ. Because it had an original story and I didn't groan over the fact that the story was being told for the 17th time. I really appreciate what CyberConnect 2 did with the story in these games from a story and gameplay standpoint. While I don't like some of the open world stuff or even a few of the filler fights that are just really boring, I like the boss fights, the highlights of the story, and I really just like the fact that it told the best and most likable segment of Naruto Shippuden. I would really say that as long as you stay away from the online mode in this game, you'll surely love it. Even the online is fine, but the connectivity is terrible and people aren't playing this game anymore, so I couldn't really get that much in terms of footage for it. The player base is largely gone since this was a game that came out in 2010, and Storm 4 is more crowded now, and along with the fact that by the time Connections comes out, players will definitely be on that. I like the gameplay of online multiplayer, but the actual online part is abysmal. I would just say play locally with a friend or something if you really want that experience. Also, the roster for this game is much bigger and doesn't have support exclusive characters. Thank God! I would say that I would have liked to see some of the pre-time skip characters, but the characters here are largely pretty good. Shit, they even put Lars Alexanderson from Tekken of all characters. You know, a bit left field, but it's still a fun addition to the roster. As for balance, well, I don't think it worked in that department. Although it's not really my place to talk about that. I don't think for a competitive fighter that this really works due to how large the roster is, but that's not really a problem for me because I don't really play those type of fighting games anymore. Besides maybe Smash Bros, and even that's for casual. Every character here seems to play basically the same, but they feel different enough from each other. I feel like that's only the case, but it's still too early to judge since this game is slowly progressing with its combat system and its characters. I wouldn't really say the series is exactly at the point where I can have a favorite character for technical reasons than cool ultimate move. Naruto Storm 2 is a genuinely great game, and a great step forward from Storm 1. Even with the rough parts, the combat is majorly improved upon and less janky. The story is retold amazingly, while taking its own spin on certain aspects of the manga and the anime. The visuals are amazing, the set pieces and bosses are great. It's just a very complete game. I still have some issues with the click-through dialogue, a few weird creative choices, and things carried from Storm 1, but it's such an improvement that it almost feels perfect, and like no game could actually top it. I would for sure recommend this game to anyone that likes Naruto, or wants to re-experience the best parts of early Shippuden. Well, there's no way but up, I guess. Alright, just to get this out of the way, this video is really weird for me to structure because I didn't know whether to include the spin-off games or not. I wanted to include Generations after 2 and Revolution after 3, but I scrapped that because I felt like even though they contributed a fair amount to the overhauling of the series and the game's combat systems, after their release, they don't really feel like they have that much significance after they came out. They were fun, but also placeholders considering how little they did for the series in terms of adding new characters and having a new story to tell. Also, the version of Naruto Storm 3 that I'm showing is the full burst version. This has an extra mission, which is the fight between Itachi and Sasuke versus Kabuto. It's a fun extra mission that has quite a bit of challenge. I guess it's fine that it wasn't in the original game, as it would have been seen as pretty unnecessary, but yeah, it's pretty fun. Anyways, with that crap out of the way, let's actually get to the game now. So this game came out in 2013, which was pretty significant considering the Naruto franchise at this point. By the time Naruto Storm 2 came out, the Great Ninja War arc had already begun and was ongoing in the manga. By 2013, the manga was beginning to wrap up the arc, but the anime was so far behind and only got to the part where Madara showed up. The whole point of me saying this is that this game had to have more original parts because it was adapting an arc that wasn't even over yet, but the devs were also making this game under obligation. Either way, the story is actually really good. Even though it is kinda clear that certain corners were cut a lot of the time, or a lot of things were changed for the sake of this game existing at all. They also add a lot of stuff for the sake of playtime, or make smaller bits a lot more grand than they were in the anime and manga, just like Storm 2 did. I wouldn't say that the 5 Kage Summit arc was not important, but it definitely didn't feel as large in scale as this game makes it. Seriously, the cutscenes in this game are exactly how I like them. They don't have stupid click-through dialogue in the most important sequences, and they're very well animated. It does allow the pacing to feel less slow than the last game, because you don't have to do that press A, press X bullshit just to hear dialogue. One thing I didn't like, which is a bit of a small annoyance, is that they cut the Sasuke fight with Killer Bee, and they just showed it through a screenshot of the anime with a film grain filter over it. Not only did we not get to play through one of my personal favorite fights in the series, we also just got it mentioned in passing as if it wasn't that big of a deal. They also cut the scene of Madara soloing the shinobi, but I guess it makes sense as to why they did that, since it wouldn't be an interactive moment in the game, it isn't, and considering the fact that it'd be more fun that way rather than just watching it, they probably trapped themselves in a corner with that one. I think a small cutscene would have still been fine, to be honest. Even with that, honestly, that's just kind of a nitpick. It does make the story like 2% make less sense, or just lessens the impact of some bits of the game. The story itself, though, is still amazingly retold in my honest opinion. I would say that Storm 2 probably had my favorite story because it had more likable parts of the anime adapted in my opinion, but Storm 3 has quite a few great moments as well. I would say something I like about this game and the series overall is how it treats more stuff like a bigger deal than the manga and anime did. There really isn't much to say about the story that I didn't say about Storm 2. They retold the story very well with very well animated cutscenes that made it more fun. I have just one thing to say about the story, and specifically, its ending. The ending of this game is completely original. They wanted to maintain the free roam, so of course they didn't want to end it with a cliffhanger. They decided to make Madara get away, like in the I'll get you next time gadget sort of ending, with Naruto defeating Tobi, who totally isn't Obito. So of course, with an ending like that, it was somewhat of a point of contention for the fans. I think it's a perfectly fine ending, honestly. I mean, no one else really knew too much about what would happen in the future, and it was also way too early to adapt the last arc at that point. And you know, the whole nature with spoilers and the like. It's also hard to abridge the last part of a story that most people probably haven't seen, besides the dedicated fans that read the manga. Whatever. Anyways, I will also say that the visuals in this game are better here. Thankfully, like the second game, they kept the motion blur in the fights without making it look nauseating. The action scenes especially are so much better here for the most part, and pretty visually clean. So we know that the story and visuals are great, but what about the gameplay? The gameplay is largely the same as 2, but with a pretty big difference. See, this game follows up Storm Generations, which introduced the substitution mechanic to the main numbered games. This is different from the last 2 games because now you don't have to mash the right trigger, and you can just press the left one while having a different bar for it. This is a great addition to the combat because it makes the simple combat feel less mashy. I like this mechanic because it's not spammable either, and there's actual strategy instead of having it just be a get out of jail free card. The substitution can still be easily countered in spite of it being an escape button, but then you can counter that counter if you really wanted to. It's a great mechanic that adds a lot of complexity to the fundamentally basic combat. The actual combat itself, just like the last one, is genuinely really good. It really feels like it's slowly removing the jankiness of the last few games, and I would say that there's still a limited amount of mechanics that keep it from being somewhat complex. The one-button combos are perfectly fine, but the best way to remedy this sort of thing is by adding more mechanics to give it some sort of depth, in which so far the series is slowly progressing towards. In the story, the boss fights of this game are not as good as Storm 2's, but I really like them anyways. I think they feel as large, if not larger in scale, in terms of gameplay. I just feel like they're a bit slower this time around compared to the last one. I think my favorite boss here is the one where you fight Kura, but the most visually spectacular one is the Madara fight with the 5 Kage. Storm 3 also introduces the ultimate decisions, where you pick between hero and legendary. Usually the legend is harder, but it's still great to challenge the players. I think for the last bit, pick hero, because otherwise taking on the Jinchuriki will absolutely destroy your mind. Even on hero, it kinda kicked my ass, but I'm not really good at video games in the first place. One thing I still dislike is the health carrying over between fights. It's not that bad earlier, since the fights are easier, or there aren't as many fights, but later on it becomes a pain because they just don't space out the fights very well. It especially sucks when you try to close the game and then it just resets you to before the first fight. Meaning that if I wanted to put the game down, I would have to put my console in rest mode instead of turning it off completely, and I would have to go back in so I can resume. The saving only works if you're near these save points, and you can't just save at any point in the game, nor is there really much of an autosave, unless you complete a chapter or something. I know this seems like a really small issue, but it mildly annoyed me. The game also still has that open world of Storm 2, and it still sucks. The open world here sucks even more because you'll more often find yourself bumping into walls than in 2 because of the camera angles. The angles aren't the only issue though, because the actual movement has to be limited to compensate for said camera angle, just like the last game. I feel like the open world was just really unnecessary in these games, because it just existed to make the game seem longer than they already were. The open world isn't the worst thing in the world, but you still travel way too slowly. It doesn't really help that the world is barely lively either. I guess it's more full of life than Storm 1, where NPCs literally did nothing outside of their looped programming. But it still just feels dull, and I really wish that they had the chapter-based mission structure that they'd have in the later games, but I'm getting way too ahead of myself. The story mode is pretty good, but I also hate these hub worlds because they kill all pacing for the game. I get being immersed in the Naruto story, but I also feel like as if the immersion shouldn't be breaking the pacing. Storm 2 and 3 honestly would be so much better if they ditched the open world. Oh well, let's move on. The roster for this game is bigger than last time, and it actually includes Part 1 villains like Zabuza and Haku, which is pretty cool. Although the only reason why they actually include them was because they were reanimated in that same arc that this game is adapting, but whatever. I also like how the reanimated characters can switch between the reanimated ones and the live versions. I really like this roster far more than last time, and the fact that we can play as Madara now is great. And of course, the ultimate moves are so well animated in this game. The online mode might just be a tad worse, however, but again, Storm isn't really the best with netcode and online. I will say this is the point where people started to become more tryhardy in this game. That's not really this game's problem, in all fairness though, but it is pretty notable, especially once we get into Storm 4. I just think that overall, there isn't much to say about this game that I didn't say for Storm 2, other than it improves a lot of fundamentals. I don't think it's as good as Storm 2 in terms of story, and even the boss fights are a bit slower this time around, but there's still a lot to love here. I especially like how it retells the story in a way that's more impactful than the anime ever could be. Overall, Naruto Storm 3 is a great game, and probably the best Naruto Storm game so far in terms of gameplay. This game is very fun. It really feels like it's moving closer and closer to not just being the best in the series, but also being the best Naruto game, period. It's a very good game that's probably drawing closer and closer to being the best anime arena fighter, but not yet the perfect game for this series or this genre. In spite of the ending for this game seemingly capping off the Naruto story, there's still one more game that does that with just a bit more impact. Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm 4 is probably the most interesting of the Storm series. I've kind of had a weird relationship with this game, not because it's bad, but because it's the best game in this series, but also has a lot of stuff that was just such a massive step back from the last two games. This is one of the few actually amazing games that somehow gives me really mixed feelings. The thing I feel most mixed on is the story mode. The story mode for this one is very frustrating to me. Kinda like the story it's adapting, to be honest. This one retells the rest of the war arc after Tobi is revealed to be Obito. I think for the most part it's done well, especially towards the ending, but there are so many flaws that it almost killed my enjoyment. First off, the lip syncing in this game is even worse than it was in the last two entries. It's not to say that the Storm games had very good lip syncing ever, but it is to say that somehow it's worse here.
さっきネジ兄さんが言った。ナルト君の命は一つじゃないって意味。
At least before, it just felt kind of delayed, but now it's worse, especially if you played in English, which I didn't. Honestly, a small negligible issue, so at the very least I don't have to hear the click-through dialogue of Storm 1 and 2. I think the biggest issue I have with the story mode are the cutscenes. The actual cutscenes look really good most of the time, besides the really grainy lighting at the beginning. But unfortunately, this does the thing that a lot of modern anime games after it did, which was slideshow cutscenes. Woo! Yeah, every single modern anime game after this one just seems to have these weird, cheap cop-out cutscenes instead of actually animating cutscenes because the developers were really rushed to make this game. Even when they try being creative, it just comes off as counterintuitive, like having comic-style cutscenes. But in that case, I could just read the manga if I wanted to. I don't think the slideshow cutscenes wouldn't be so bad if they didn't have some of them for the most important parts of the story. For some reason, when Naruto goes against Obito in his Jubi form, there are slideshow cutscenes for the emotional moments. The worst part about this is that it's not even like original or anything. It's literally just screenshots from the anime that they had at the time. The thing about these cutscenes though is that it's pretty much during the first half of the game. After that fight I mentioned, they almost cease to exist, which is great. However, the only reason from here on out why there aren't any of these lazy cutscenes was because the anime, when this game came out, wasn't finished yet. But the manga had been finished for like 2 years at this point. So CyberConnect 2 animated some great cutscenes later on, but that was only when they literally had to because there was jack all of shit for content. However, in spite of my gripes over the cutscenes, the game's story mode had really nothing fundamentally wrong with it. The only real issue, besides adapting a part of Shippuden that I didn't really like too much up until the ending, so I guess that's like the only real criticism. The actual story mode itself is pretty good. I like that it tries its best to do what the other Storm games did, and improve on the parts that sucked. Although there's no fix for that stupid, convoluted, cancerous bloodline story that sticks out like a fucking tumor. I still think the story is adapted pretty well, or at least as well as it can. I think that towards the end of the story mode it gets so much better because it feels like the story that CC2 wanted. The first half was more focused on reusing assets for the most part, but after a while the slideshow cutscenes stop being as frequent, and when they actually tell the story they want, it's great. Even though I complained about them only using cutscenes when they had to, I'm still glad that they had to in the last bit because otherwise it would have been pretty underwhelming. I think it was a great choice because in the last half of this arc, the anime, well, yeah, it wasn't really finished yet. But I feel like if there was any part of the anime that was finished at this point, they would have probably copped out of it too and just had a bunch of standstills. I will say that the game's introduction is really great here. I know it's kind of pointless, but you had to make Madara and Hashirama fight somehow, I guess. I still love this fight because it sets the stage in the best possible way. People like to say that God of War Ragnarok had one of the best openings in video games, but for me, this is pretty damn close to that. The first boss fight in the game has such well done context-sensitive moments. It also comes with excellently timed ways to introduce the mechanics of the game. I also love the different phases and how it goes from normal one-on-one fighting to straight up kaiju fighting. It excellently segues into a title card too. Speaking of fights, the gameplay is really good. I feel like I'll talk about more of the combat after I talk about the story mode, because that's for the better part of this game. But there are plenty of new features that honestly are best used outside of the story mode to feel like they meet their full potential. I will say the boss fights in the story mode aren't as good as 2's, being a little easy for my taste, but they're much faster than 3's. I like the set pieces more, even though the battles were much crazier in 2. I also feel like the QTEs were a bit more punishing in the last 2 games. I still like the boss fights here because they're still somewhat challenging besides the QTEs. Honestly, the story is weird to me in this game. It seems lazy if you look at the cutscenes where they just used a bunch of screenshots from the anime. However, it's also really great in spite of being the worst story mode from a cutscene standpoint. I loved a lot of stuff about this game, like the boss fights being pretty good, even though the game took a lot of shortcuts that seemed lazy in the first half. There were still plenty of amazing segments, and the last half was so good that I didn't really care all that much. The last chunk was so genuinely good even though it had a story that I didn't really like all that much. The best part about this game is how it adapts the ending. They could have honestly delayed the game, or just made more filler content, or created an original ending, but they didn't do that. And by the end it genuinely feels like an ending instead of just doing it for the sake of adapting the end of the manga just because of a checklist. The final parts have so much care that it almost feels like the anime. And if I was one who didn't either read the manga or watch the anime, I would actually think that it was adapting the anime. Stormforce's first half honestly just feels like what the entirety of the game could have been had the anime adapted the parts with Kaguya or Naruto vs Sasuke. It could have and would have been a rushed and boring way to end this series. The story would have had a few sparse moments of being incredibly fun and action-packed, but honestly it could have overall been seen as boring. I'm so glad that the story got so much better in the second half and it completely eclipsed the first part. This game's story was just so weird. There's so much to dislike where it feels like they cut corners, but in the best parts of the story, it's not just sprinkled, but doused with so many amazing moments throughout that it almost nullifies the issues. Even in the first half where they were clearly taking a bunch of shortcuts due to being on crunch time, they still fully animated a lot of the most important scenes in the anime. Most of the time. Most of the screenshot cutscenes were honestly just talking scenes anyways, but at the same time what worked about the series cutscenes in 2 and 3 was the use of the digital camera, even during the talking scenes. Either way, Stormforce story mode still works well enough. I don't think it's the best story mode because if we're excluding Storm 1, that story is almost non-existent. 4 was probably the worst. Either way, if Stormforce story is the worst EC2 can do, then they have basically nothing to worry about, for the most part. It doesn't have the best parts of 2 and 3, but when it does, try to reach those highs from the anime and those games, it does come close, and in some cases surpasses moments like Naruto vs. Kakuzu and Naruto vs. Pain in Storm 2, or even Naruto vs. Sasuke in Storm 3, along with Naruto vs. Ninetales. For the sake of comparison, this is like the Return of the Jedi for the Storm games. It was somewhat sloppy and had some moments I disliked, but by the time it really kicks into high gear, it's genuinely amazing. That's the best way to describe this game's story mode. It's a bit of a mess and has lots to dislike or even hate, but the actual conclusion is so good that you just don't think about the flaws from earlier as much. I feel for a long time now I've just been pontificating over stuff that could have been better, and pretty much praising what did work because it was genuinely great. Overall, the best way I could describe this is that it was the worst and best of the Storm series. It totally introduced stuff that was more quality of life that I liked, such as selectable chapters, allowing for these to be far less monotonous by trudging through open worlds like the last few games, which even carried over to CC2's own Demon Slayer game, which created a whole new issue of trudging through the open world even after selecting a chapter. Either way, in spite of the bumpier issues, the story was still fairly great. Anyways, can we move on to the gameplay? Wait, there's another story mode? There's two fucking more! So the game basically has an adventure mode, which is the narrative takes place after Shippuden. It's basically just filler content that would have probably happened between the war arc and the last. It's really dull, to be honest. I like that most of the areas have full camera control, but the movement is so ungodly slow. Even with open areas with full camera control, there are still segments with fixed camera angles like the last two games. Honestly, I would have been fine if this mode didn't exist, even if it stops something from the other games. Also, the actual narrative part is really dull, the dialogue isn't even fully voice acted either, just a grunt and a simplification for a bunch of 10-word sentences. It's really just a mode to show you how mundane the series is when shit isn't going on, which the filler episodes already do anyways, so what's the point? The open world is boring and the fights are just standard. There aren't any standout moments and you don't even unlock anything at the end. In spite of having this game since it came out back in 2016, I never touched this mode until now because I'd already unlocked all the characters, so why bother? It just sucks that somehow this mode is simultaneously the best and worst open world in the entire series. It was great because they actually fixed that damn camera issue, for the most part, but it sucked because it was just so boring and nothing in it at all was there that felt compelling. I feel like in Storm 1, despite the mild jankiness and the world being fucking dead, it had the best hub world because it was the closest thing in a Storm game to being in a fun open world Naruto game. At least we have Rise of a Ninja for that, I guess. It was really disappointing how they fix certain elements only to blue ball us in the end. Adventure mode sucks, and honestly, I wouldn't blame you for forgetting about it or ignoring it. You unlock nothing, and you're better off playing a completely different mode. Oh, what a nice transition. Boruto's Tale is pretty much a retelling of the Boruto movie, and it's actually pretty good. As someone who liked the Boruto movie, in spite of the anime and manga being quite whatever, I still think that this mode is incredibly quick and fun. It's not quite as long as the main campaign, but considering that this is DLC, who cares? I like this campaign more than Adventure mode because it's not a boring slog. It has cool fights in between that don't feel monotonous and perfectly recreates the movie, especially in the final act where Naruto and Boruto do the father-son Rasengan. Am I the only one who sees a similarity? Boruto's Tale is cool, and it's not the longest or the deepest thing, but it's still pretty fun. Anyway, moving on. Okay, we can finally talk about the online mode and the gameplay. There's a lot of stuff they added to the combat this time around since Storm Revolution came out 2 years beforehand. They added the counter, which isn't as broken as it was in Revolution because it actually pushes enemies back instead of just stunning them, allowing you to have a free win. I like how they also allowed for the player to actually freely move this time. Originally, for the last few games, you only had to tap the A button or X button, depending on if you're on Xbox or PlayStation, whatever, to move out of the way to dodge. But here you can actually just block and move the left stick after blocking. It seems very small, but a small change that makes movement less restrictive. It also makes movement more accurate, so you won't launch forward into an enemy when you don't need to, for the most part. This is also the first Storm game to actually allow you to switch characters mid-fight. The other games use them as supports with cooldown timers. In here that's also the case, but you can also use them like characters, like a Marvel vs. Capcom 2 and 3 sort of thing. So if you're good enough, you could easily switch characters if, say, an enemy escapes your combo, and you basically can call in your support to finish your combo. Storm 4 also has Team Ultimate attacks from Storm Revolution, where if you have specific characters and fill up a meter, they can have their own exclusive team attack. It's really cool because it does add a little bit of variety to the combat. It's more style over substance, but it's still cool enough for me to not care all that much. Really not much was added from the last few games in terms of combat, but it just feels a lot better. This game's combat is just perfect for this series. This has to be the best Storm games in terms of control, and even combat. Even though the characters have like the same basic combos, the characters feel different enough from one another for the game to not really make them feel samey. The character roster here is the biggest in the entire series. It has every character from the last 3 games and even Mecha Naruto from the pre-order bonus and the Road to Boruto pack and everything else. I mean, I guess that's fine. I like this roster because even though it doesn't really have that much balance, it's still a fun selection of characters. I know this game will never be like it, but it's kinda like Smash Bros, where it has so many characters, but the game is so fun that it still feels somewhat technical. Honestly, that's fine for it to have this many characters, because as long as the core mechanics are still fun and fair, it's perfectly fine. I know this game has a lot of minor character variations and whatnot, but somehow this game's roster was way bigger than Jump Force. I'm sorry, that's enough joking about Jump Force in this video, I swear. I think having a big roster, even if unbalanced, is fine, but if the gameplay sucks, then the roster sucks. There's a reason why stuff like Xenoverse 2 and Smash Bros are better with this shit than other games. Anyways, Jump Force is a dead horse. Didn't I just promise to like not make a joke about it again? So the actual worst and in some ways best part is the online mode. There's a lot to talk about here, so I'll just make it insanely brief. Okay, so I played this game on PS5, which has crossplay with the PS4, blah 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 blah, which has the biggest player base for the game. The game really has this weird system for some reason, where the network is based more off of input delay, and most of the characters you encounter, well, depending on where you are, they're yellow barred, which means moderately decent connection, not good, not bad, but still some lag. Unfortunately, it makes the game not feel as smooth, and when you fight with someone with a red barred connection, it's even worse because then the game becomes a mashing fest. However, when and if you find a good connection, you'll be fine. But the other issue is that if you disconnect/rage quit multiple times, it keeps track of it and you're more likely to disconnect from the game randomly. This sucks especially if your game randomly crashes and you have to take that into your disconnection counter. So the idea is to not rage quit, but at the same time there are still crashes and it screws over your match and your online reputation. Either way, the online mode is still fun when it works. I would say that this online mode is bad with connection, but these games usually don't have that figured out anyways. Not defending a god-awful online, but it's usually not the main focus of the series anyways. I will say that 2 and this game have the best netcode, but honestly, just play with friends. Anyway, Naruto Storm 4 is the best Storm game, and probably the best Naruto game. It has so many flaws, but the visuals and combat make up for its issues. The story seemingly cuts corners at times in the first half, but when the effort really mattered, CC2 gave it their all, and by the second half, they put their full effort into it. They really didn't have to adapt the ending before the anime did, but I applaud them for being ballsy and doing it anyways, because they did it amazingly. This game was a great end for the Storm series, in spite of its flaws. And honestly, I respect this game for that. The Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm series started with something mediocre and basic, but then expanded into the holy grail for anime games, basically. There's a really good reason as to why it's so successful outside of the fact that Bandai Namco used the Naruto IP. This series has to be one of the most influential anime games, so much so that it was basically an influx of non-Dragon Ball anime arena fighters that came out around this time. The series, in spite of its own underwhelming start, finished with a bang anyways. Whenever people think of anime games, usually this series comes to mind most of the time, which really is quite something, to be honest. Unfortunately, a lot of modern anime games, especially after Storm 4, just suck, with the exception of the main 3 Dragon Ball games that came out right after this. It's kinda sad to see that a bunch of anime games, especially arena fighters, are received so poorly for just being really rushed now. And then we see them constantly compared to Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm like that's an expectation they could possibly live up to. Mainly because they already built the expectation and there's almost nothing that can really exceed it besides itself. And so with an announcement of Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm Connections releasing sometime in November, well, all I have to say is please do not screw this up.